You're too soft, Robert. Picking up strays won't fix your loneliness. Martha once jabbed, a quiet widower driving solo through life, blind to the storm one stop would unleash. That rainy night, he pulled over for Emily, a soaked stranger with secrets, her plea tugging at his small-town heart. Days later, sleek black cars rolled into Mapleton, their engines humming a threat he couldn't yet name. Hello everyone. Welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today I'm going to tell you another heartwarming story, so let's dive into it. The rain poured relentlessly from the dark evening sky, hammering against Robert's windshield as he drove down the empty country road. His wipers worked frantically to maintain visibility, but the downpour was merciless. At 62, Robert Williams had grown accustomed to driving alone, just as he had grown accustomed to living alone since Margaret's passing 3 years ago. The comfortable silence that once existed between them had been replaced by the static of an old radio and occasional sighs that escaped his lips without permission. Tonight, however, the silence would be broken by something other than memories or music. Through the sheet of rain, Robert's headlights illuminated a figure standing on the roadside. A woman, drenched and dejected, with one arm raised in a hesitant plea for help. Robert slowed his weathered pickup truck, decades of small-town values overriding the caution that normally accompanied modern hitchhiker scenarios. As he pulled to a stop beside her, he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her 30s, wearing a once elegant outfit now ruined by the storm. Her dark hair clung to her face in wet strands, and despite her obvious distress, there was something dignified in her posture. Robert rolled down his window just enough to be heard over the drumming rain. "Need some help, miss?" Robert called out, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age and concern. The woman approached his window, relief washing over her face. Up close, he noticed her intelligent eyes, tired but alert, scanning him quickly, the universal calculation of a woman determining if this stranger posed a threat. Whatever she saw in Robert's weathered face must have reassured her, as her shoulders relaxed slightly. "My car broke down about a mile back," she explained, gesturing vaguely behind her. "My phone's dead, and there's no service out here anyway." Robert didn't hesitate. "Hop in," he said, reaching across to unlock the passenger door. "This storm isn't letting up anytime soon." The woman climbed in gratefully, bringing with her the scent of rain and expensive perfume, an odd combination that somehow suited her. As she settled into the seat, Robert turned up the heat, noticing her slight shiver. "I'm Robert," he offered, putting the truck back into drive. She tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear and gave him a tired smile. "Emily," she replied simply. "Emily Jones. Thank you for stopping." Not many people would these days. There was something in her tone, a weariness that suggested this wasn't just about the rain. "Where were you headed?" Robert asked, keeping his eyes on the road as visibility worsened. Emily sighed, her breath fogging the window slightly as she gazed out at the passing darkness. "The Pinewood Inn, if it still exists. It's been years since I've been in this area." Robert nodded, familiar with the modest but charming bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town. "It's still there, though they've changed owners twice since the Hendersons retired. It's about 15 minutes from here." Emily nodded absently, and Robert sensed she was somewhere else mentally. He didn't press for conversation. Years of marriage to a woman who processed thoughts privately had taught him the value of comfortable silence. Instead, he turned the radio volume down a notch and focused on navigating the treacherous roads that wound through the hills surrounding Mapleton, the small town he'd called home his entire life. "If you don't mind me asking," Emily finally spoke after several minutes of silence, "what brings you out on a night like this?" Robert smiled faintly, appreciating her attempt at normal conversation. "Thursday night dinner at my sister's place. Been a tradition since my wife passed." Martha doesn't take no for an answer, even in weather that would make Noah nervous. Emily's expression softened at his mention of loss, a flicker of recognition passing through her eyes. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said quietly. Robert nodded his thanks, the grief no longer raw but always present, like an old injury that ached when rain was coming. 3 years now. Cancer. Quick, but not quick enough, if you know what I mean. Emily nodded solemnly. "I do know what you mean." As they approached town, the rain began to ease slightly, allowing glimpses of Mapleton's modest main street. Storefronts with their lights still on glowed warmly against the wet darkness, and a few brave souls hurried along the sidewalks under umbrellas. Emily observed it all with curious eyes. "It's charming," she commented, and Robert felt an unexpected surge of pride. "Been here all my life," he said. "Wanted to leave when I was younger, had dreams of designing clothes in New York or Paris. Emily turned to him with genuine interest. "You're a designer?" Robert chuckled, the sound warm and self-deprecating. "Was going to be, life had other plans. Took over my father's hardware store instead. Still sketch sometimes, mostly for myself." Emily was quiet for a moment, studying his profile as he drove. "It's never too late, you know," she finally said, her voice gentle but firm. Robert glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "At 62? With arthritis in my hands and reading glasses thicker than the bottom of a Coke bottle?" He shook his head, a smile playing at his lips despite the twinge of old regret. "Some trains you just have to watch leave the station." Emily didn't argue, but something in her expression suggested she disagreed. As they turned onto Pine Street, the Pinewood Inn came into view, a Victorian-style house with warm yellow lights glowing in its windows, its signs swinging gently in the wind. "Here we are," Robert announced, pulling into the gravel driveway. "Looks like they're still open. Would you—" Emily hesitated as Robert brought the truck to a stop. "Would you like to come in for a cup of coffee? It's the least I can offer for the ride." Her invitation seemed genuine, tinged with something that might have been reluctance to end their brief connection. Robert considered it for a moment. Martha would be wondering where he was, but he could call her from inside. Besides, there was something about Emily, a curious blend of vulnerability and strength, that intrigued him. "Coffee sounds good," he agreed, switching off the engine. They hurried through the drizzle to the covered porch, where the inn's door opened before they could knock. Mrs. Collins, the current proprietor, greeted them with surprise. "Emily Jones!" she exclaimed, recognition lighting her face. "Your father called hours ago. We've been worried sick." Robert watched as Emily's expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a forced smile. "My car broke down," she explained simply, not elaborating on why her father would be calling ahead or why her breakdown warranted such concern. Mrs. Collins ushered them inside, fussing over Emily's wet clothes and making immediate arrangements for hot beverages. The lobby of the inn was exactly as Robert remembered it, warm, wooden, with a large fireplace that currently housed a cheerful blaze. As they settled into armchairs near the fire, Mrs. Collins disappeared to prepare their drinks, leaving them in a momentary bubble of privacy. "So," Robert began carefully, "your father knows the innkeeper well enough to call ahead?" Emily's smile was tight as she warmed her hands by the fire. "My father knows everyone," she said, a hint of something like resignation in her voice. "Richard Jones? The tech mogul?" Robert's eyebrows rose in surprise. The Jones technology empire was well known even in small towns like Mapleton. Emily nodded, watching his reaction closely. "That would be him. I'm afraid I've caused quite a stir by going off-grid for my little road trip. He tends to overreact." Robert nodded slowly, piecing together the subtext. A wealthy man's daughter, driving alone on country roads, deliberately out of contact. There was a story there, but he wasn't one to pry. Mrs. Collins returned with a tray of coffee and freshly baked cookies, setting it down between them with motherly efficiency. "I've called your father back," she told Emily. "Let him know you're safe and sound." Emily's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she said politely. "Did he say if John was still coming?" Mrs. Collins nodded. "First thing in the morning. The helicopter can't fly in this weather, so they're sending a car instead." Robert nearly choked on his coffee. Helicopter? Just who was this woman he'd picked up from the roadside? Mrs. Collins turned to him with newfound interest. "And you must be—" Emily jumped in before he could answer. "This is Robert. He kindly gave me a ride when my car broke down. He saved me from a very long, wet walk." After Mrs. Collins left them again, Robert sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "So," he said finally, "helicopters, huh?" Emily laughed, the sound genuine and surprisingly youthful. "Sorry about that. My father has a flair for the dramatic. I'm just his daughter, taking a break from the family business." She hesitated, then added more softly, "I needed some space to think, some perspective you can't get in boardrooms and luxury hotels." Robert nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. "Sometimes you need to step away to see clearly," he agreed. "Margaret, my wife, used to say that all the time. Whenever we had a big decision to make, she'd insist we go fishing first." Said the answers were clearer by the water. They talked for nearly 2 hours, the conversation flowing with surprising ease between two strangers from vastly different worlds. Emily spoke of the pressures of being the heir to a technology empire, of board meetings where older men dismissed her ideas, of charity galas where people saw her name tag before they saw her. Robert shared stories of small-town life, of the hardware store he'd inherited instead of pursuing design school, of Margaret's battle with cancer, and how the entire town had rallied around them during her final months. As the clock struck 11, Robert realized he'd completely forgotten to call his sister. "Martha's probably organizing a search party by now," he said, standing reluctantly. "I should get going." Emily walked him to the door, away from Mrs. Collins' curious ears. "Thank you again, Robert, not just for the ride, but for—" She paused, searching for the right words. "For treating me like a regular person. It's rarer than you might think." Robert smiled, sensing the truth in her words. "You are a regular person, just one with a helicopter on standby." His gentle teasing made her laugh again. As he turned to leave, Emily called after him. "Robert? What would you do with it? If you could go back and take that train, become a designer, what would your first project be?" The question caught him off guard, but the answer came surprisingly easily. "A small collection, classic pieces with modern touches, clothes for real people, not just models. I've always thought fashion should be accessible without sacrificing quality." Robert slept poorly that night, his mind replaying the strange evening and the unexpected connection with Emily Jones. He wondered if he'd ever see her again, doubting their paths would cross in any meaningful way once her father's people arrived to collect her. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world and scattered debris. Robert went through his usual routine: coffee, breakfast, opening the hardware store at precisely 8:30 a.m. He was arranging a new display of gardening tools when the bell above the door jingled. Looking up, he was startled to see Emily, now dressed in fresh clothes but with the same intelligent eyes and gentle smile. "You're still here," he said, unable to hide his surprise. Emily approached the counter, glancing around the well-maintained but clearly aging hardware store with interest. "The car arrived, but I sent John back with a message from my father. I told him I needed another day." Her expression turned slightly mischievous. "I think poor John was terrified to return without me, but I can be rather persuasive when necessary." Robert chuckled, wiping his hands on his apron. "I can imagine. So, what brings you to Williams Hardware on this fine post-storm morning?" Emily's expression turned more serious. "You do, or rather your designs do. I'd love to see them, if you're willing to share." Robert blinked, taken aback by her request. "My designs? They're just sketches, Emily, nothing special." But something in her earnest expression made him relent. "Let me close up for lunch early. They're at my house." An hour later they sat at Robert's kitchen table, various sketchbooks spread between them. Emily flipped through them with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions about a particular design or fabric choice. Robert felt strangely vulnerable, watching her examine these private dreams he'd tucked away years ago. "These are remarkable, Robert," she said finally, looking up at him with something like determination in her eyes. "They shouldn't be sitting in a drawer." The sound of helicopter blades thudding through the air interrupted their conversation. Emily sighed, closing the sketchbook reluctantly. "That would be my father," she explained. "He's not one for subtlety." Robert walked her to the door, feeling an odd mixture of disappointment and resignation. This brief intersection of their lives was coming to its natural close. "It was nice meeting you, Emily," he said sincerely. "I hope you find whatever perspective you were looking for." Emily paused at the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I think perhaps I have," she said cryptically. "Would you mind if I borrowed this?" She held up one of his sketchbooks. Before he could answer, she added, "I promise to return it personally." True to her word, Emily Jones returned exactly 1 week later. This time, however, she arrived with a black town car instead of a helicopter, and she carried a sleek leather portfolio along with his sketchbook. Without preamble, she laid both on the counter of his hardware store. "I showed your designs to some friends of mine," she said, a barely contained excitement in her voice. "People in the industry, people who matter." Robert stared at her, not comprehending. Emily opened the portfolio, revealing printouts of his sketches, now professionally rendered with fabric swatches attached. "They love them, Robert, especially the accessibility concept. Fashion that's both high quality and practical for everyday people." Robert's hands trembled slightly as he touched the rendered designs, his ideas brought to life with a professionalism he'd never imagined. "What exactly are you saying, Emily?" She took a deep breath, her eyes bright with possibility. I'm saying that Jones Technology has been looking to diversify our portfolio. We've been considering moving into sustainable fashion for some time now. She paused, gauging his reaction. I'm offering you funding, Robert, to start your own line, small at first, but with our backing. Your designs, your vision, our resources. Robert felt the room spin slightly. Why would you do this? You barely know me. Emily's expression softened. Because 3 years ago, I lost my mother too, and in her final days she made me promise not to let my father's world consume me entirely, to find something that was mine alone, something I believed in. She looked around the hardware store. This place was your father's dream, not yours. My proposal is selfish, really. I want to head this division of the company, work with designers who see fashion the way you do, and I want to start with you. The offer hung between them, impossible and yet somehow inevitable. As if their meeting in the rain had been setting this moment in motion all along. The next morning, a helicopter landed once again in Mapleton, causing quite a stir among the townspeople. This time, however, it brought not just Emily Jones but her father as well, Richard Jones, the tech mogul himself, who spent 3 hours in Robert's kitchen discussing business plans, investment structures, and vision statements. By evening, when the helicopter departed, Robert Williams stood in his yard with a contract in hand and a future he never dared to imagine. Martha found him there, still staring at the sky long after the helicopter had disappeared. So, she said, linking her arm through his, a clothing designer after all. Margaret would have loved this plot twist. 6 months later, Williams Designs launched its first collection, classic pieces with modern touches, made from sustainable materials, priced for accessibility without sacrificing quality. The small manufacturing facility on the outskirts of Mapleton employed 15 local workers, with plans to expand. Robert's modest home now included a studio addition where he worked alongside 2 young designers from the local community college. Emily flew in from New York twice a month to review progress, offer business insights, and share dinner with Robert and Martha, becoming something of an honorary family member in the process. The local newspaper ran a feature story about him, calling it Mapleton's Second Act, with a photo of Robert standing proudly in front of his designs. Sometimes at night, when the studio was quiet and the moon cast soft shadows through the windows, Robert would imagine Margaret there, smiling that knowing smile of hers, as if to say, I told you it wasn't too late. On the 1-year anniversary of their chance meeting in the rain, Robert and Emily sat on his porch, watching a summer sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. A gentle breeze carried the scent of Martha's roses from the garden, mingling with the distant sound of cicadas beginning their evening chorus. Emily ran her fingers along the arm of the handcrafted rocking chair, a gift from one of Robert's longtime hardware store customers who now supplied reclaimed wood for their packaging. Do you ever wonder? Emily asked quietly, her voice thoughtful. What would have happened if my car hadn't broken down that night? If you hadn't been driving that particular road at that particular moment? She paused, watching a hummingbird dart between the feeder and the nearby trumpet vine. Or if you'd been like most people and just kept driving when you saw a stranger in the rain? Robert considered the question, thinking of all the small decisions and coincidences that had led to their meeting. His sister's insistence on Thursday dinners, the storm that nearly made him cancel, the exact timing of Emily's car trouble. He thought about how close he'd come to letting his dreams fade completely, how easily their paths might never have crossed. Margaret used to say there are no accidents, he replied finally, his weathered hands resting on a sketchbook filled with ideas for next season's collection. Just opportunities we're not expecting. He smiled, remembering how often his wife had pushed him toward chances he might otherwise have missed. She also used to say that kindness always finds its way back to you, though rarely in the form you'd expect. Emily smiled, raising her glass of lemonade in a toast. To unexpected opportunities, then, she said, and to kindness on rainy nights. Robert clinked his glass against hers, marveling at how a simple offer of shelter had changed both their lives forever, creating a connection that neither time nor distance could diminish. Proof that even in a world grown cautious and cold, the warmth of human kindness could still work miracles. Thank you for listening to this story. If you like it, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story of Narrative Whispers.